I watched the Evil Dead trilogy for the first time, and that was probably a top 3 best decision I've ever made in my life. It sits right next to Showing Up to My Own Birth alongside every time I played LEGO Star Wars. The Evil Dead trilogy is one of the most fun and unique movie trilogies that I've ever seen. Never have I seen a trilogy so completely different in each movie, yet all of them feeling completely coherent, while all being completely different labors of love. The first movie in this trilogy, The Evil Dead, is just a straight up horror movie, and a really great one at that. It just completely dives in on trying to be as creepy and unnerving as possible, and still 40 years later, it's great. Then Evil Dead 2 is this wild, zany horror action comedy movie about Ash, our main protagonist of the series, that we'll get back to later, as he ends up being back at the evil cabin and now has to kill the demons, but this time it's even more nuts and crazy. Within the first 10 minutes, he decapitates his girlfriend, he's thrown through space and time, and then he has to start fighting reanimated corpses. This might sound like a Looney Tunes episode, and it basically is, and that's why it's the greatest thing ever, and cinema peaked here, and we're probably never going to get a movie as good as this. Then the third movie, Army of Darkness, is this wacky Monty Python-esque movie of Ash being dropped in medieval times and viewed as this godsend from the heavens to save this kingdom from Lego Ninjago skeletons. And this is just as wildly nuts as Evil Dead 2. We eventually just have skeletons roaming this castle, fighting Ash while he has a shotgun, and him fighting a version of himself that's jaw keeps falling off. All of these movies, just off their pitches alone, are these incredibly unique and interesting films, and together it is one of the most unique trilogies to ever be made. And that is why these movies deserve recognition. With Evil Dead Rise coming out, where it just looks like another movie in the franchise, I will not allow these original three masterclasses in filmmaking and ingenuity be forgotten. So let's look at the Evil Dead trilogy and why it's still just so good. Well, you know, that doesn't sound right. Why it's so groovy. There we go, now we're talking. I think the main reason why this franchise is just so fantastic is that when you look back on the movies, they never feel like they were made out of obligation. With many recent movie trilogies, it seems like the director made one movie they liked, and then they were held hostage to finish a trilogy, and by the end it looks like they were attending a funeral on the red carpet. But not the Evil Dead trilogy. Every movie here feels like the entire crew came together and put everything they had into making a great individual movie. And they just ended up doing 3 of them. And all of these movies are brought to life by the director Sam Raimi. You might know him as the director of Oz the Great and Powerful. That's probably the best thing he's ever done in his career. Everything else is kind of a footnote. But Sam Raimi is one of the best living directors. He has shown over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times that he can make incredible movies in the Hollywood system without his vision really being altered. And that is why these movies all feel so incredible and personal. All of these movies feel like they're coming from the personal view of one director, not a committee. Even in the third film, Army of Darkness, where they have the biggest budget, we have scenes where skeletons are using their own bones as flutes, and Bruce Campbell is murdering demons in a grocery store. Like, this is amazing. Who makes a third movie like this? This man does, and that's because he is the greatest director ever known to live, and he will have Spider-Man thrust whether you like it or not. And that passion and small crew feel, I think, is why each of these movies is truly as excellent as they are. When Sam Raimi and main actor Bruce Campbell started out in the first Evil Dead, all they had was a budget of $375,000, and yet with that they ended up creating such a uniquely creepy and amazing horror film. The story of 5 students going to a cabin and accidentally releasing demons is a very basic plot, yet the movie is so effective, from its incredible camera work to its great performances and amazing makeup effects and genuinely terrifying moments. It is so sincere with what it's trying to achieve, and it never backs down from its horrifying or gross moments. It feels like a movie that had no one looking over the crew's shoulder, and it makes it one of the most pure horror films to ever be made. You see in studio horror films, like let's say with The Ring, where the studio clearly neuters the movie, saying, oh wait, that's too scary, you're gonna have to cut this, audiences will be too scared, we can't show demon face. But The Evil Dead is just this absolute thrill ride of horror, never allowing for a moment to compromise its vision for the audience. When you start watching this trilogy, you'll sit back in shock at just how effective a horror film the first movie is, and just how visceral of a reaction it must have gotten out of people in the 80s. This is probably the scariest stuff they'd ever seen in their lives. It's like The Exorcist girl, but the whole cabin is filled with them. Who allowed this? This man did, because he let Spider-Man hip thrust. Then, after dropping one of the most interesting and most fun horror movies ever made, then the boys got back in the lab and decided to make one of the best, most incredible, zany sequels ever made, and pretended like we weren't gonna notice that Evil Dead 2 just dropped. Like, this is incredible. I think Evil Dead 2 is one of the best sequels ever made. I would put it in the top 5 best sequels ever, next to The Dark Knight, Blade Runner 2049, Empire Strikes Back, and Cars 2. Evil Dead 2 is the greatest thing ever. The story follows Ash from the first movie, once again played by Bruce Campbell, as he heads back to the evil cabin that he stayed at in the first movie. Do we ever learn why? No, he's just a moron, but this simple decision alone has huge ramifications on why this movie is one of the best movies ever made, and that is how they pivoted Ash Williams from this normal teenager to one of the greatest horror protagonists of all time. Ash in the first movie is just this normal dude who was put into this bad situation that only kept getting worse and worse, but in Evil Dead 2, Ash Williams transforms into this insane man who will do anything to survive, and he's just completely nuts now. He chops off his hand with a chainsaw chainsaw, he's thrown through an entire forest, he's possessed by demons multiple times, he chops up the female version of the whale with a chainsaw. You might be saying, wow, way to cherry pick the best parts of the film for this section, but no, this is just an appetizer for what happens in the entire film. More happens in this movie within an hour and 20 minutes than will happen to you in your entire life. This movie has enough creativity for 100 movies, yet it is all crammed into 80 minutes of runtime, never for a second feeling like it is ever close to running out of ideas. There's so many incredible scenes, genius moments, hilarious parts, and incredible direction that by the end of the movie you will be looking at every other movie and just wondering, what are we even doing? Like, just go home, Evil Dead 2 did it better. And that absolute awe towards movies isn't something I have felt in a long time. I loved watching all three of these movies because they felt so pure. It felt like everyone involved with them truly loved making them and wanted to make the most fun movies that they could make. And with how corporate movie making can get sometimes, it can really just bum me out with how bleak the future of cinema can seem. And seeing now that Evil Dead has turned into its own franchise, it's kind of disheartening to see how these really personal films just ended up being a generator for more serious, boring movies. But when you watch these movies, that childlike imagination in you is reignited. That constant imagination of movies, the incredible worlds, the amazing moments, all brought to life by a cast and crew that truly wanted to make something amazing. Sam Raimi started directing the first Evil Dead when he was 20 years old, and it is filled with so much passion that you just can't help but be inspired. The Evil Dead trilogy is so much fun. It's so magical. It creates one of the most fun protagonists of all time and creates these three films from the absolutely own and creates one of the most fun and unique trilogies of movies that have ever been made. This is one of the great trilogies of all time, and there's only one little bit of wisdom I can give to you guys. Go watch the movies!